Dump trucks groaned up the gravel drive at 5 in the morning. 6 of them, one after another, tailgates cranking open. Apples poured out in a bruised, brown-flecked river, thousands of them, cascading across Marlene Kestler's back pasture like a landslide of rotten gold. She stood on her porch in a flannel coat, coffee steaming in her hand, and watched without a word of protest. The Cannery men wouldn't meet her eyes. By sunrise, the pile stood taller than her tool shed, apples spilling into the fence line, wasps already circling. Marlene walked out barefoot into the wreckage, picked one up, turned it over in her palm, and smiled like she'd been waiting for this exact delivery her entire life. By noon, half of Piney Fork had heard about it. Cars slowed on the county road just to look. Some folks laughed. Some shook their heads. Nobody could explain why a woman 2 years widowed, already behind on her land taxes, would let a cannery unload 20,000 pounds of garbage apples onto her property and pay her nothing for the privilege of doing it. Marlene just kept walking the pile with a bushel basket on her hip, sorting rot from rescue, humming something low under her breath. What she was building out there, nobody in that county would understand until the day it landed on their tongues. Before we get into how this story unfolds, if you found your way to this channel, we'd love to know it. Drop a comment and let us know what corner of the world you're watching from tonight. And if stories about grit, land, and second chances speak to you, consider subscribing. There's more waiting for you here. Auber County, Missouri, sat in that stretch of hill country where the roads curved more than they ran straight, and the land remembered every family that had ever tried to farm it. Piney Fork was its only real town, a feed store, a Baptist church, a diner that closed at 2, and a courthouse with peeling paint. Marlene Kestler had lived on Route 9 her whole married life, on 60 acres her husband Delmer's family had held since before the Depression. Delmer had died of a heart attack in the tool shed 2 winters back, wrench still in his hand, and left her the land, $1,100 in savings, and a stack of unpaid property tax notices she hadn't known existed. Her son Wendell was 16 and quiet in the particular way boys get when they've watched a parent grieve too long alone. Every morning before school, he'd walk the fence line with her, checking for downed wire, saying almost nothing, handing her tools before she asked for them. It had become a kind of ritual between them, wordless and steady. The two of them moving through the orchard rows in the gray light, breath fogging, boots crunching frost. It was one of the only hours of the day that still felt like it belonged to the family they used to be. The old Kestler orchard had once supplied apples to 3 counties, but blight, bad prices, and Delmer's failing health had let it go wild, rows of trees choked with vine, half the fruit dropping unpicked every fall. When the regional cannery over in Salent had a warehouse fire and lost its cold storage, they needed somewhere fast to offload a season's worth of cosmetically rejected apples before they rotted in the truck beds. Marlene was the only landowner in the county who said yes. Her neighbor Cassius Denby, who ran 300 acres of soybeans next door, told anyone who'd listen that she'd lost her sense. "She's letting them dump their trash on good bottomland," Cassius said one Sunday outside the church, loud enough to carry. "Widow's got no income, and she's out there collecting garbage apples like they're gonna hatch into something." A few men chuckled. Odessa Rourke, who ran the feed store and had known Marlene since grade school, didn't laugh. She'd seen the same look in Marlene's eyes that Marlene used to get as a girl, right before she did something nobody expected. Odessa kept her mouth shut and her opinions private, but she started saving her broken barrels and cracked mason jars in the back room, just in case. What the county didn't see was the barn. Marlene had spent the fall clearing out Delmer's old equipment shed, dragging out rusted plows and a tractor that hadn't run since Reagan was president. In their place, she'd hauled in second-hand fruit presses bought off a shuttered orchard 2 counties over, a stack of glass carboys from an estate sale, and a wall of mason jars Odessa had quietly been setting aside. She worked by lantern light most nights after Wendell went to bed, grinding apples into pulp, pressing juice into buckets, testing yeast in mason jars lined along the windowsill like a science experiment nobody had asked her to run. She wasn't wasting the reject apples. She was making cider, hard cider, the old-fashioned way her grandfather used to make in Kentucky, back before Prohibition scared the family out of the business. Bruised apples, scabby apples, apples too small or too lopsided for a grocery store shelf. None of that mattered once they were crushed and fermented. What mattered was flavor, and rejected apples, picked at full ripeness instead of picked early for shipping, often carried more sugar and more character than anything sold in a supermarket bin. Marlene had learned that from an agricultural extension pamphlet she'd read 4 times over, dog-eared and coffee-stained on her kitchen table. Wendell found her one night elbow-deep in apple mash and asked flat out if she'd lost her mind, same as everyone in town was saying. "We need groceries, Mama, not moonshine." Marlene didn't answer with words. She poured him a small taste of the first batch, 3 weeks fermented, still rough around the edges. He made a face, too tart, too strange, but he didn't spit it out. And underneath the sourness, there was something bright and honest that neither of them had words for yet. "It's not moonshine," she finally said. "It's an inheritance nobody thought to give us, so I'm taking it." Then came the letter. A county agricultural notice, stamped and certified, arrived the second week of October. A cluster of apple maggot larvae had been reported in orchards along Route 9, Marlene's included, and the state had issued a quarantine order. 45 days to prove the property compliant with pest control protocol, submit to inspection, and register any commercial fruit operation, or the county orchard board would condemn and burn the entire pile, trees and all, to stop the spread. 45 days. Marlene read it twice at the kitchen table, hands steady, jaw tight, while Wendell watched the color drain slowly from her face. The timing gutted her. 45 days wasn't enough to finish fermentation properly, let alone bottle, label, and legally sell a single jar. Worse, commercial fruit operation meant paperwork she didn't have money for, bonding fees, a state cidery license, inspection costs that ran into the hundreds. She drove into Piney Fork and sat outside the county extension office for 20 minutes before she could make herself go in. The clerk, a tired man named Harlan Prout, told her plainly that most first-time applicants took 4 to 6 months to get licensed, not 45 days, and that burning was standard procedure when landowners couldn't comply in time. For 3 days after that, Marlene didn't go near the barn. She let the presses sit idle, let the carboys bubble unattended, let the mash on the counter start to sour past saving. Wendell found her sitting on the porch steps at dusk on the 3rd evening, staring at the pile of apples still heaped along the fence line, and for the first time in 2 years, he watched his mother look defeated. "Maybe Cassius was right," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Maybe I built something out of nothing because I didn't want to admit there was nothing left to build with." It was Odessa who pulled her out of it. She drove out unannounced the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a folder full of paperwork she'd been quietly filling out on her own time, bonding applications, a list of state-approved inspectors, even a sample commercial license pulled from a cidery 2 states over. "You didn't build nothing," Odessa said, dropping the folder on the porch rail. "You built something so real it scared the county into a rule book. Now we follow the rule book faster than they expect us to." Marlene looked at the folder a long moment, then reached for her boots. What followed was the hardest stretch of work Marlene had done since Delmer's funeral. She and Wendell hand-thinned every remaining apple on the trees, bagging fallen fruit, clearing brush, doing everything the extension pamphlet said would satisfy a pest inspector. She drove 2 hours each way to the state licensing office 3 separate times, filling out forms in the parking lot because she didn't trust the mail. She sold Delmer's old truck, the one he'd restored himself, the one Wendell had learned to drive in to cover the bonding fee. Wendell didn't argue about the truck. He just helped her sign the title over without a word. With 11 days left on the quarantine clock, the fermentation still wasn't ready, the labels still weren't approved, and the inspector hadn't even scheduled his visit. Marlene stood in the barn one night surrounded by bubbling carboys, 45 days feeling more like 45 minutes, and for the first time let herself say out loud what she'd been afraid to admit, that she might lose the orchard, the pile, and the last piece of Delmer's land all in one county-ordered bonfire, no matter how hard she'd worked. Wendell, sitting on an overturned bucket beside her, finally spoke. "Then we make sure they can't burn what's already gone." On the morning of the inspection, the county truck rolled up the drive with 2 orchard board officials and a man carrying a clipboard and a drum of accelerant. They expected a pile of rotting apples and an unlicensed widow. Instead, they found the barn doors thrown wide open, mason jars gleaming in neat rows on folding tables, hand-lettered labels reading Kestler Orchard Cider, and Marlene standing beside a stack of state paperwork bound with a rubber band. Every form signed, every fee paid, filed 2 days earlier than the deadline required. The man with the clipboard stopped walking. He hadn't expected to find a business. He'd expected to find a bonfire. Behind him, a delivery van from a Springfield restaurant supply company pulled into the drive, followed by a second truck from a distributor out of Kansas City, Odessa's doing. Word passed quietly through a cousin who tended bar at a farm-to-table place that had tasted a jar Odessa slipped them weeks before. Drivers began loading crates of bottled cider straight off the tables while the inspector was still counting mason jars. The orchard board man lowered his clipboard. He hadn't come to shut down a pile of trash. He'd come to burn $20,000 of contracted, bonded, already sold product, and the law didn't let him do that. By afternoon, half of Piney Fork had driven out Route 9 just to see it for themselves, trucks lined along the fence, crates stacked shoulder-high, Marlene's barn smelling of yeast and crushed apple and diesel exhaust. Cassius Denby stood at the edge of his own property line, arms crossed, watching drivers haul away product faster than Marlene and Wendell could carry it. He didn't say a word. Odessa handed him a jar anyway, unopened, and told him to try it before he made his next speech outside church. Cassius took it. He didn't open it in front of anyone, but he didn't hand it back either. By spring, Kestler Orchard Cider was carried in 11 restaurants across 2 states, and the pile that had once drawn laughter along Route 9 was gone, pressed, bottled, sold, replaced by neat rows of new trees Marlene and Wendell planted together that April. The county record's office quietly amended her file from condemned agricultural property to licensed commercial operation, a change Harlan Prout stamped without comment, though he did buy a case for his own kitchen. Wendell drives a new truck now, one he paid half of himself, hauling cider crates instead of hay. Marlene still walks the orchard some mornings barefoot, the way she did the first day the trucks came. Cassius Denby never gave a speech retracting what he'd said outside the church. He didn't need to. Every fall since, he shows up at harvest time with his own truck and a case of empty jars, and helps carry apples nobody else wanted into a barn that turned rejection into something worth 6 figures a year. Around Piney Fork, they don't call it the reject pile anymore. They call it the orchard that grew out of a burn order, proof that what the county marked for fire, Marlene Kestler had already turned into something worth saving, one bruised apple at a time.